Welcome to A Lovely Wallpaper, a podcast exploring an underappreciated way of appreciating poetry by committing it to memory. To know a poem by heart means having a worry stone, a provocation, a comfort, a quick exit, always close at hand. Lose yourself in a poem, gain a world with its mastery.
The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost, that a loss is no disaster.
In this special October episode, to celebrate the shortening days and the long somber nights, I have something a little different planned. No interview, no poem. What I want to do today is listen to a ghost story, which is found in the beautiful 1961 novel, The Chateau by William Maxwell. The ghost in the story is a memory double, which takes the place of truant school children and recites their lessons for them brilliantly. This horrifies the teacher in the story, while one after another the students gleefully take advantage of their shape-shifting doppelganger. The classroom dynamic changes dramatically at the hands of the ghost, and listening to the story, one just might find a roadmap for contending with a different modern-day spirit, the generative AI that has been reshaping the way students learn and remember. The scene of this story within a story is a classroom, the sort of harsh classroom of the past where the focus was on rote memorization and forced recitations. These archaic practices should be familiar to the longtime listeners of this podcast who heard me speak with Catherine Robson, scholar of the Victorian age and author of the book Heartbeats, Everyday Life and the Memorized Poem. That work examined compulsory memorization as the site of triumph and horror in the classroom, and the poem she presented, Elizabeth Bishop's Casabianca, was a moving send-up and interrogation of the performances adults ask of children. Actually, since I started this podcast, I have been collecting passages that relate to memory and recitation, wooing scenes and moments of blowhardery, as well as classroom scenes. Of course, it all started with the very title of the podcast, A Lovely Wallpaper, which makes reference to a moment in Susie Boyd's novel, Loved and Missed. The narrator there, an English teacher, speaks of assigning her students poems to memorize so that they might have a lovely wallpaper for their lives, words to return to in times of boredom, waiting, anxiety. I also have a special guest reader here today, Christine Schutt, a fiction writer and teacher, once very briefly my teacher, whose every sentence is a carrier of meaning and beauty. In her novel, All Souls, set in a school, students are haunting, though none go full poltergeist like in Maxwell's supernatural classroom. To prepare for this episode, I reread a few of Christine's books to find out how her characters prize the memorized verse. Of course, I found a few great passages for my collection. In All Souls, one devastatingly beautiful and devastatingly sick child has competed in the English-speaking Union Shakespeare contest. And, quote, she had remembered the speech as well as the sonnet. What a memory she has, one teacher says to another. In another of Schutt's novels, Prosperous Friends, a husband reels off a line from Andrew Marvell's to his coy mistress, to his own retreating cold fish of a wife. Here is the passage. "Let's go home," he said, and she looked up and saw he was far ahead. "Why so fast?" But Isabel Bourne caught up at the crosswalk and took hold of his hand and ran through the throbbing warning. A cold front or a damp front. In any case, a new front was coming in. The change for the worse in the weather chilled them. At home they drank soup, and he sang aloud to her. The grave's a fine and private place. Night's disarray and rain and his disappointed face. I asked Christine here today because I started reading William Maxwell's work after seeing her mention him in an interview, and because I thought she would like this passage and read it as beautifully as she once read Jane Eyre aloud to my 8th grade class. So I really thank her for agreeing to join me and I can't wait until we do a normal episode together and I get to discover what poems she will choose to present. Hello, Christine.
Hi.
So there are a few things to set the scene before we begin. This story is embedded in William Maxwell's The Chateau, which is a story of an American couple who goes to tour France just a bit too early after World War II. Their reception is complicated, but they are sensitive and, as I read in one review, anxious to connect. In this passage, the couple are riding back to their hotel on bicycles after leaving a party that the family of their French hosts has brought them to. The party was full of moments of amazement, boredom, and cultural miscommunication. As a narrator expresses, protagonists Harold and Barbara Rhodes don't catch the whole story, as their French is imperfect and the distance between their bicycle and the storytellers is always changing. Christine, is there anything else you think listeners would need to know to contextualize the story before you begin reading?
No, I think it takes shape very quickly.
Okay, great. Well, then in that case, would you go ahead and begin?
I will. I'm beginning in a village.
Yes.
In a village near here, she said, but a long time ago, there was a schoolmaster who drove himself into a frenzy trying to teach reading and writing and the catechism to boys who wanted to be out working in the fields with their fathers. He had a birch cane, which he used frequently, and an expression which he used still more. Whenever any boy didn't know his lesson, the schoolmaster would say, "One dies as one is born. There is never any improvement." Then he'd reach for his birch rod. One rainy autumn evening when he got home, he discovered that he had left his examination books at the school, and though he could have waited until next day to correct them, he was so anxious to find what mistakes his pupils had made that he went back that night after his supper. A waning moon sailed through black clouds, and the wind whipped his cloak up into the air, and the familiar landscape looked different, as everything does on a windy autumn night. And when he opened the door of the schoolhouse, he saw that one of the pupils was still there, sitting on his bench. "Don't you even know enough to go home?" he shouted. "One dies as one is born." And the boy said in a voice that chilled the schoolmaster's blood, "I was never born, and therefore I cannot die." With that, he vanished.
Now I know what she's like, Harold thought. This is her element, telling ghost stories. And this filtered moonlight, all this silveriness. The supernatural shouldn't be understood too well. It should have gaps in it for you to think about it afterward. What he missed because he didn't know the words or because their bicycles swerved, drawing them apart for a moment, merely added to the effect.
The next day, the schoolmaster was very nervous when he came to teach the class. He looked at each face carefully and saw with relief only the usual ones. But one thing was not usual. Andre, who had never in his life recited, knew his whole day's lesson without a fault. Growing suspicious, the schoolmaster stopped calling on him. Even then the hand waved in the air, so anxious was he to recite. That evening the schoolmaster walked home the long way around and stopped at Andre's house and learned that he was sick in bed. So then he knew. After that, somebody always knew his lesson, and it wasn't long before the boys caught on. One at a time, they played hooky, knowing that whatever it was, a ghost, a fairy, an uneasy spirit, would come to school that day looking exactly like them and recite and recite. The schoolmaster grew thin. He began to make mistakes in arithmetic and to misspell words. He would start to say, "One dies as one is," and then be afraid to finish. Finally, unable to stand the strain anymore, he went to the curé one morning before school and told him his troubles. The curé reached for his hat and coat and filled a small bottle with holy water from the font. There is only one way that a person can be born, he said, and that is in Jesus Christ. When the possessed boy, because it can only be a case of possession, stands up to recite, I will baptize him. And that's what's happened. The schoolmaster called on one boy who didn't know his lesson after another until he came to Joseph, who was a great, doltish boy with arms as long as an ape's. And when Joseph began to name the kings of France without a single mistake, the curé said, In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sanctus, and uncorked the vial of a holy water and flung it all in his face. The boy looked surprised and went on reciting. When he had finished, he sat down. There was no change in his appearance. The schoolmaster and the curé rushed off to Joseph's house, and it was as they feared. Joseph was not there. Isn't he at school? His mother asked in alarm. Yes, the curé said, he's at school, and they left without explaining. As they were going through the wood, the curé said, There is only one thing you can do. You must adopt this orphan spirit, give him your name, and make him your legal heir. When they came out of the wood, they went to the mairie and began to fill out the necessary adoption papers, which took all the rest of the day. When they finished, the mayor took them, looked at them blankly, and handed them back. There was no writing on the documents they had spent so much time filling out. So when the class opened the next day, the boys saw to their surprise that the schoolmaster was not at his desk in the front of the room, but sitting on the bench that was always reserved for dunces. They were afraid to titter because of his birch rod, and when he saw their eyes go to it, he got up and broke the rod over his knee. Then they sat there and waited. Finally, one of the boys summoned enough courage to ask, What are we waiting for? For the schoolmaster, the man said. I have tried very hard to teach you, but I had a harsh, unloving father, and I never learned how to be a father to anybody else, and so you boys learn nothing from me. But I have learned something from the Spirit that takes your place on the days when you are absent, and I know that he should be teaching you, and I am waiting now in the hope that he will come and teach us all. After a time, Joseph left his seat and went to the desk, and in a voice of the utmost sweetness began to conduct the lesson. Are you the Spirit? The boys asked. No. I am Joseph, he said. Then how is it you know the lesson? I learned it last night. It took me a long time, and it was very hard, but now I know it. The next day, the same thing happened, only it was Andre who went to the front of the class, and right straight through the room they took turns, each day a different boy, until it was the schoolmaster's turn. Looking very pale, he stood in front of them once more, and they waited, expecting him to say, One dies as one is born. Instead, he began to hear the lesson, which they all knew. But are you really the schoolmaster, or are you the spirit that takes our place? They asked. I am the schoolmaster, the man said sadly. One dies as one is born, and I was born a man. But through the grace of heaven, one can hope to be of the company of spirits. That was the last time they ever heard him utter this familiar expression, though he stayed at his desk and taught them patiently, in a voice of the utmost gentleness and reasonableness from that time on.
Thank you so much, Christine.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to hear that in your voice. So I guess that leaves me with just a few more thoughts before wrapping up. I am drawn to this story, as we already know, because I'm interested in poetry and in classrooms, and because the children in this story recite. But beyond that, I'm fascinated by the actual logistics of this memory double and end up reading this story a bit as this anachronistic parable about AI. I spend a lot of time wondering these days, in this age of ChatGPT, what education means when we can outsource all the work, the written work, the memory work, to another entity, be it a ghost or a chatbot. The thing about this story is that in the end, Joseph, that doltish boy, ends up learning the lesson himself, and it seems like all the other kids also gain an ability and a willingness. Maybe the spirit affords the children more time and space by sitting in for them, or perhaps the spirit pushes the students towards learning because the image of self-reciting and peers reciting is powerful enough to conquer the perpetual discouragement of one dies as one is born. What ends up being more important than the boost the spirit may offer is the simple change in the teacher. The fact that he is humbled and relates to students on a human level. I love how the story reframes the teacher's annoyance at the beginning that the boys just want to work in fields with their fathers. In the end, it isn't about the fields or family or that they were doltish and unfit for schoolwork. It was that they longed to work beside their elders rather than under. Not to get dogmatic here, but whatever the tasks and tools at hand, who wouldn't prefer to be led by a storyteller driven by connection and curiosity, rather than a taskmaster atrophied by disappointment? One of the really cool things about the novel, the stories pulled from the Chateau, is that William Maxwell structured it in two parts. In the first section, much of the intrigue amongst the French characters is obscure and driven by unexplained tensions, impossible to interpret to the American protagonist and the reader alike. In the second shorter part of the book, a knowing narrator enters a dialectic with the reader who is hypothetically annoyed and dissatisfied about the ambiguities in the story. Defensive as it may seem, it's a very good-natured addendum to a book that didn't really need anything extra. In a way, to me, it mirrors on the macro level the teacher who sits down beside the students and is willing to cede some of his authority and rigid ideas of perfection and of greatness. Anyway, I'd really recommend this book, especially in this moment, if you read Rejection by Tony Tulatemute, where the self-referential in fiction feels outed as serving no artistic purpose past a cynical and defensive workaround of identity politics. Like I said before, I have no poem to offer today, no memory exercise, but I wish I had a few more ghost stories up my sleeve, ones I knew by heart, and spicy jokes too, but mostly spooky stories to bring camping with my kids and to put myself to sleep when the moon is big and yellow and the neighborhood is hung with gauzy ghosts and polyvinyl skeletons. That's all for this show, and happy Halloween. Thank you to Susie Boyd for lending me this podcast's title, to GW Sock and the X for use of their song, The Art of Losing, which borrows the words of Elizabeth Bishop. And thank you to my sound engineer, Alex.
Disaster. Except the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master.